Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. We are continuing our series on sacrifice zones, and I want to start this episode by introducing a sub-series on Cancer Alley. I had this whole plan to roll out a series of episodes about Cancer Alley and do a sub-series later on this year, but we have to do it now because last week the EPA sued two major companies that pollute in Cancer Alley. So we're moving that sub-series up. We're doing it now. So this first episode in this sub-series on Cancer Alley will be about EPA's lawsuit against Denka and DuPont. Why are they suing them? For excessive pollution in Cancer Alley, far and above many of the other places that are already polluting and are already causing problems for the residents. And the third thing I want to talk about is, what does this lawsuit mean for other polluters in Cancer Alley? Is this the start of a trend? Can we see more of this? Is this going to move the needle at all in terms of how we protect the residents that live in that stretch of Cancer Alley? Let's talk about it. So stay with us. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for listening. So last Tuesday on February 28th, the EPA filed a lawsuit against Denka Performance Elastomer, we'll just call them Denka, and DuPont Specialty Products, we'll just call them DuPont. The lawsuit is 22 pages long. I put a link in the description. I would encourage everybody listening to go and read it. Read it for yourself before you start looking at all the articles online about people's perspectives and opinions and thoughts and views. Make sure you read the lawsuit and get a full understanding of what's being said and what's not being said. So I would encourage everybody to read that and take a look at it. But just real briefly, in the lawsuit, they accuse Denka and DuPont of a couple of things. First, they say that carcinogenic chloroprene emissions from Denka's neoprene manufacturing operations at the Pontchartrain worksite in St. John the Baptist Parish present an imminent and substantial endangerment to public health and welfare. There are two words that are really important in that sentence. One is imminent and the other is substantial. They're saying it's imminent because it's happening right now. The level of pollution is so damaging right now, and that's been happening for decades. So not only is it happening now, it's been happening for a long time. And then they say it's substantial. Substantial because of how close this facility is to the surrounding residents and the wide range in ages. So there's children, there's babies, all the way up to middle-aged adults, up to the elderly. We have a wide range of people that live around this facility. And because of the magnitude of the emissions coming from the plant and the amount of exposure that the people have to those emissions, that makes this a substantial threat. So it's imminent and it's substantial. So they also say that the emissions travel beyond this parish to neighboring communities. And in the lawsuit, they identify Reserve and Edgard as those communities, and that the people living there are exposed to unacceptably high risks of developing certain cancers because of these chloroprene emissions from Denka's plant. That is in the lawsuit. That is why they are suing. And so as a result, the EPA says that this facility needs to reduce their emissions immediately to, quote, levels that no longer cause or contribute to unacceptably high cancer risks within the communities surrounding the facility. That's the words verbatim from the lawsuit. And so that is why the EPA is suing these two entities in particular. Chloroprene emissions, they're way too high, and it's been happening for way too long. They need to stop, bring them down to acceptable levels. And so in the lawsuit, they're ordering Denka to do a couple of things. First, they're ordering them to take all necessary measures to eliminate the imminent and substantial, there's those words again, imminent and substantial endangerment posed by the emissions from the facility, and to take all other actions necessary to address and mitigate the harm to public health and welfare that these emissions have caused. So basically do whatever it takes to reduce these emissions and to deal with the harm from the emissions. That's what they're asking them to do. They also ordered DuPont. So DuPont is the company that owns the land that this facility is on. So they're ordering DuPont to ensure they authorize Denka to do all this stuff because they own the land. So they're both being sued because they're both involved and both have an opportunity to deal with this issue. And so that is what the EPA is requiring from Denka and from DuPont in the lawsuit. And I will say this, one thing I'm really excited about with this lawsuit is that they're not asking for money. It's so common to ask a polluter to pay a certain fee, to pay a fine, to pay an administrative order because you've exceeded or violated your permits. And companies love writing the check. They love just paying out money. Thank you. Here you go. Here's the cash. And we continue polluting. And so I'm glad this lawsuit has no dollar signs in it, no figures that they need to pay out. It is all about reducing the pollution that these people are experiencing from this facility. That's what all lawsuits against polluters should be about. If they violate their permits, if they don't adhere to the regulations, we don't need to sue them for 1.2 million, 500,000, 2.2, whatever. We need them to stop polluting. That's what we really need them to do. And so I'm glad that this lawsuit is ordering them to specifically stop polluting and to address the harm from their pollution, as opposed to writing out checks and sending money around. So that's really exciting. So I had a couple of thoughts about this lawsuit. I don't know if I've ever seen the EPA sue a corporation. Maybe you have. I don't recall seeing that. I mean, directly suing a company for damages due to their pollution and operations. I mean, if you have, you can probably count on one hand how often that's happened, particularly from the EPA. They try to keep a low profile. They try to just do regulations. They try to just encourage the states to enforce those regulations. They don't usually come in and sue a company directly. I haven't seen that. That's one thing that's interesting. You know, I've seen them go after different cities, right? So they'll go after a city for not following through on the regulations, not upholding the Water Act, Clean Water Act, or the Clean Air Act, things like that. Or they might sue a state for not enforcing a new regulation that they've put in place, and they go to court to fight over that regulation. Is it appropriate or not? The states usually say it hinders our economic growth. The EPA says it's for public health purposes. They go back and forth. I've seen that before. And I've seen states sue the EPA, especially when new regulations come out because they don't want to have to spend the money to fix things to adhere to the new standard or new regulation. They always push back because they don't want to incur those costs and things like that. But this is different. This is the EPA actually stepping out and trying to hold major polluters directly accountable for their emissions. And I can appreciate that. You know, you don't have to always rely on the state to do it. The state might not have the resources or the fortitude to go after a large company when they're polluting so much, particularly when that company can tout its economic activities in the state or in the city, talk about the jobs they've created, talk about the economic boost that they've given to the economy there. And so it's good that the EPA comes in and says, look, we still have rules. You have to abide by the rules, and you can't just pollute and pollute and pollute. And I think we need more of that. And we will be better off if organizations who regulate enforce them, period. Not trying to figure out a way to go back and forth. We have a rule in place for public health and for environmental protection. If you violate that rule, we will sue you so that you will come into compliance. Easy. And I think that's perfectly fine and normal and appropriate for the EPA to do. I hope they do it more often. And Cancer Alley is a good place to start because there are plenty of people there, plenty of corporations there, violating permits, exceeding their limits, and dumping on the most vulnerable communities in the country. Black communities, small children, families, people who don't have the resources to push back, the political capital to push back against these large multinational corporations. And so EPA, you're more than welcome to find some more people to sue. Go in and let them be served. And so that's the lawsuit that they have against Denka and DuPont. So what is the basis for it, though? How are they able to go in and actually bring this suit to this organization? Well, this lawsuit is driven by emissions of a chemical called chloroprene. Just some quick facts about chloroprene. In case you're not familiar with chloroprene, it is a raw material that is used to make neoprene. Neoprene is a nice rubber. It's used in all kinds of stuff. Hoses, automotive belts, wetsuits, koozies that you put your drink in. I know for me as an engineer, when we install water piping, we use neoprene gaskets to prevent leaks. So you put the two pieces of pipe together, you have a neoprene ring in between the two so it doesn't leak. Neoprene is a very useful material, and it is produced by using chloroprene. Chloroprene is flammable, it's colorless, and most importantly, it evaporates at room temperature. So it goes into the air very easily. We would say it's highly volatile in that sense. And as a result, the EPA has classified it as a hazardous air pollutant. You go to the Clean Air Act, it is on the list of hazardous air pollutants because it has been shown to increase cancer risks when you breathe it in. So that is why they're being sued. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Here's a fun thing to take home with you. This facility in St. John the Baptist Parish, ran by Denka, is the only facility in the whole entire country that emits chloroprene. Think about that. No other place in the country will you find this chemical in the air except here. It really is unfortunate. And so as a result, the EPA has a limit on how much you can emit into the air based on the research and the analysis done around chloroprene and its cancer-causing risks and how harmful it can be. The EPA has said you can emit no more than 0.2 micrograms of chloroprene per cubic meter. In this lawsuit, they're alleging that Denka has exceeded that amount. And if you read the lawsuit, you'll see that the EPA has their own air monitors and Denka has their own air monitors that they've put around the facility, around the neighborhoods to see how much chloroprene is being emitted into the air. And guess what? Both sets, not just the EPA's, but both sets of meters have shown that Denka is emitting chloroprene at a much higher rate than that limit that the EPA has instituted. And just for some context, so there's a history here at this facility. So the state regulators in Louisiana came in 2017 with a consent order forcing Denka to reduce their emissions because they were so high that it exceeded all of the metrics that were in place to prevent elevated cancer risks in the surrounding communities. And so they came in with their order, and Denka agreed, and they complied with the order. So listen to this. They upgrade their equipment. They install control devices. They even purchased a regenerative thermal oxidizer to help them reduce emissions. And they reduced their emissions. They actually did it. 2018, 2019, they reduced their emissions. Normally you would say, well, good job, thank you, that's all we wanted. But there's just one problem. Even with those reductions, currently they emit 18 million tons of chloroprene each year. And the monitors in the neighborhoods, the monitors around the site have registered readings between 0.4 and 2.9 micrograms per liter. Now remember, the limit is 0.2. We got now currently, after reducing emissions, 0.4 on the low end to 2.9 on the high end. So they're emitting up to 15 times more than the legal limit after they've reduced their emissions. So just let that sink in for 1 second. How bad was it before 2017 that they can reduce their emissions and still be that far above the limit? How damaging could it have been for the people living there to have this plant in place emitting that much pollution to the point where even after they've reduced it based on a requirement from the state, that you're still so far above the federal limit of what you can emit. That's how bad it was. And these communities are vulnerable. These are not people who can handle these kinds of emissions and do well for themselves. I mean, first of all, they're in Cancer Alley. That means there's a lot more facilities in their area emitting a lot more chemical and air pollutants that are harming them physically. But then there's also elementary schools, hospitals, nursing homes, places where people who are vulnerable go to get care and education, and they're being exposed to these levels of toxic chemicals day in, day out, every day from a young age till they get older. It's just horrifying to think about. And it's disappointing to see how flagrant the polluting is from this plant. And if you want to know more about it, there's a great report about this plant and its history of polluting. It's called Waiting to Die, Toxic Emissions and Disease Near the Louisiana Denka Petrochemical Plant. It is definitely a must read to get more information about this plant and what it's been doing for decades. I put a link in the description. I promise you need to read it because once you go through it, they do a study, they talk to people that live around there, and that title comes from a resident who literally said, "We don't know what to do here. We're basically waiting to die." That's what our life is like here in the shadow of this plant. And so I'm thankful that the EPA has stepped in with a lawsuit. I think they have good grounds to force them to reduce their emissions further because there's a rule, there's a regulation that they are clearly violating, and they need to stop in order to protect, at least minimize their damage in these communities. I imagine at this point people have experienced so much damage from this plant that it's going to be hard to recover from. And there needs to be a lot of investment and a lot of interest in helping communities that live in these areas that have been dumped on for so long. But this is a start. We need to start by holding these types of facilities accountable and by forcing them to reduce their emissions. We're not asking you to shut down and move or leave. The EPA is not telling you to pack up and go home. They're just saying, abide by the rules. Just do what the regulations say. It's for the protection of the people around you. That's what we should do. And that shouldn't be controversial. And it shouldn't rise to the level of lawsuits in court. We should all expect facilities and chemical plants to abide by the rules that they agreed to when they started their operations. That shouldn't be a challenge. It shouldn't be so hard to do. So I'm glad that this is happening. But I guess my last question is, what does this mean moving forward? What about other corporations and plants in this area or across the country who are dealing with these kinds of issues, these environmental justice issues where these plants are clearly placed in particular regions for a purpose? And there's a demographic of people who are being exposed to these high levels of toxic emissions, these elevated cancer risks on a daily basis. It's not a coincidence who's around these plants, who lives there, and who works there. It's clearly an environmental justice issue that needs to be addressed, and I'm glad the EPA is at least taking a step toward it. And so what can we expect moving forward? So I don't know. I know one thing that this lawsuit tells me is that the EPA has the power to sue corporations. You know, it might not sound novel to you, but it was novel to me when I saw that. I said, oh, wait a minute. So this whole time, the EPA could be suing these companies. It's not up to just the state or the city or the community to put pressure on these corporations. The EPA can do it. So that was good to see. It also was good to see that history doesn't have to continue the way it's been going. You know, there's this idea that things have always been done a certain way and it'll never change. And, you know, you can grandfather yourself into previous arrangements and previous agreements and not have to worry about the way things are changing moving forward. But this lawsuit suggests to me that no matter how long a facility's been polluting, no matter how long they've been in operation, they can be held accountable. They can be sued and they can be required to follow through on the regulations that are currently in front of them, that are currently in place. And so I'm excited about that. I hope that this is just the beginning. I hope that more polluters, more facilities, more corporations are held accountable for the ways that they are dumping on and violating the human rights and the public health of these communities, these fence-line communities that don't have much in terms of financial resources or political power, but they know, they feel, they see around, they can recognize when they are being dumped on disproportionately. And they can tell just from looking at their community, they're so invested in the people around them and they're so connected that they know, oh, she has cancer, they died from cancer, that person has cancer now. That person is really young to be dealing with that kind of health issue. I wonder why there's so much asthma in our neighborhoods. I wonder why these kids at this school are missing so many days due to health reasons. They know it's because of these plants and these facilities. And I want to see the EPA do even more to identify more polluting chemical plants, refineries, facilities that are clearly violating what they agreed to in their permits as they operate, and to come in and to do something and protect the health and well-being of the populations. If the city can't do it, if the state can't do it or refuses to do it, the EPA should. And it's not too much to ask for them to come in and do that. So let's see how this turns out. I'm not sure how it's going to end. I can promise you Denka and DuPont are not going to just say, oh, I'm sorry about that, we'll reduce our emissions, and then just do it. I promise you they're not going to just argue the merits of the lawsuit itself. They're going to go as deep as they can and try to undercut the EPA as much as possible to try and demonstrate that they're even in the wrong arena trying to sue them. I imagine they're going to challenge the regulation itself, the 0.2. How'd you get 0.2? It should be higher. They've already questioned classifying chloroprene as a hazardous chemical. They don't even believe that should be happening. And so there's going to be a lot more that happens in this lawsuit. I'm interested to see how it ends up, how it gets resolved. This lawsuit will set the stage for how the EPA deals with corporations. And I think it will be a blueprint for anybody who's fighting against the facility to think about what their options are. So when you're sitting in your home, you see those smokestacks outside your window, and you've been talking to your city council, you've been talking to your county, you've been talking to the state, to the regulators, to all the people around you that you're supposed to talk to about dealing with those kind of issues, you can then petition the EPA to come in and deal with it, and they can do it. They have the authority to do it. And so that's something that I think we'll be able to leverage in the future, because this lawsuit, at least on its face, demonstrates that the EPA has that authority and that ability, and we should leverage it in any situation we can to bring about compliance from these facilities. We should definitely do it. And Cancer Alley, in my opinion, should be ground zero for all of this type of litigation, community action. It's been happening here for a long time. In future episodes in this sub-series, we're going to talk about Cancer Alley in more detail. But just know the EPA is suing 2 corporations in Cancer Alley, and so it is not beyond the pale for them to sue more. And I hope that they do, because I think it would bring positive change to Cancer Alley and to other parts of the country that are dealing with these polluters creating these sacrifice zones where they profit on the backs of the communities that they are positioned in, and doesn't have to continue that way. Thank you for listening. This has been the Environmental Justice Lab podcast, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.